Forum on Democracy continues in the Chinese capital, Beijing, with the theme of shared human values. Participants from over 50 countries, regions and international organizations are attending both online and in person. Wang Siwen has the story.
The second phase of International Forum on Democracy continues in Beijing with a focus on democracy and national governance. Wang Linggui of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences said it's a joke for the U.S. to call itself a beacon of democracy. He said the U.S. has long-standing problems of freedom of speech in its electoral system, corruption and human rights. And he said 50 million people have been affected by COVID-19 in the United States and 800,000 have died.
Pakistan decided not to attend the United States' so-called Summit for Democracy. It has shown Pakistan's attitude and stance. We need to think about the reasons behind it. U.S. democracy hasn't brought South Asia any peace, stability, richness. The debacle in Afghanistan left a deep impression on the Pakistani people.
Any country which seeks to impose on others its own brand of democracy based on its civilizational values and norms is by itself undemocratic in nature. This is not an altruistic deed of liberation as claimed, but a coercive move, infringing the liberty of choice of the people on the receiving end.
Attendees at the forum from across the globe expressed various perspectives on the meaning of democracy and national governance. For instance, one Argentinian expert suggested social development is essential to true democratic life, and an expert from Albania said global governance should be more inclusive and less instrumental.
Democracy should be judged by how much people's wishes are being fulfilled by the government. Democracy should serve as the end goal, rather than just a fixed format to which assumptions and practices can be applied.
While China says it applies whole process people's democracy, which has distinctive Chinese characteristics.
In China, we are always saying that to give the people a fish. It's good, but not the best. The best way is to teach the people how to fishing. So I think it's also in accordance with the principle of the whole process democracy. When we try to help our people who live in remote mountain areas, we also teach them how to change their own life.
With the COVID-19 still having a huge impact around the world, the forum is calling on countries to fight the pandemic and not to use democracy for the wrong reasons and to avoid fake democracy. Wang Siwen, CGTN, Beijing.
China has strongly condemned the Alliance for the Future of the Internet, a proposal by the United States at the so-called Summit for Democracy. The alliance reportedly aims to establish an open and reliable Internet order based on American standards. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson says the U.S. is trying to impose its own standards on others. He says it will no doubt place restrictions on and deprive developing countries.
The so-called Alliance for the Future of the Internet, promoted by the U.S., is another example of it trying to split the Internet, seeking technological monopoly and cyber hegemony, and suppressing technological development in other countries. The United States attempts to impose its own standards on other countries. It is trying to restrict and deprive others, especially developing countries, of their right to choose partners in developing the Internet. It is also trying to prevent countries from enjoying the dividends of digital economic development and technological progress.
Well, a lot of controversy with this Summit for Democracy. 55 world leaders were on the call immediately, virtually, with President Biden's two-day event got underway. Over 100 nations participating, but a lot of people saying, should the US be participating? Let's face it, we're going up on the year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, where about half the country still believes that Joe Biden, the president, stole the election, and there's gerrymandering across the United States, from Wisconsin to Texas, in terms of pushing democracy aside in terms of partisanship. Well, Joe Biden says that the US is approaching this from a feeling of humility, and that the US can learn as well. Let's take a listen.
Democracy needs champions. And I wanted to host this summit because here in the United States, we know as well as anyone that renewing our democracy and strengthening our democratic institutions requires constant effort. American democracy is an ongoing struggle to live up to our highest ideals and to heal our divisions, to recommit ourselves to the founding idea of our nation.
But of course, the US has chosen who is a democracy and who isn't with the guest list, although they insist that is not the case. Off the list was Turkey, for example, Hungary, and on the list were Taiwan, most controversially, and Brazil, perhaps, as well. India was included despite criticism. What is concrete? Well, the US is providing a lot of money, actually, about $500 million for election integrity, to try and make sure that democracies are transparent, fighting corruption, and also sharing best practices. Now, of course, there has been criticism, especially from Russia and China, who see this as essentially as a wedge issue. The US is trying to divide between what it sees as Western democracies and more authoritarian forms of government. Now, what's going to come out of all this? Well, remember, this was a campaign pledge by Joe Biden just as the election was underway and all the problems with that followed, and he wanted to have a democracy summit. It's the sort of thing he could pledge before being president. But this whole idea of bringing democracies together basically follows almost a climate change format. They're going to follow up every year, share best practices, and of course, even though nothing is binding, the US wants to center itself as a democracy while obviously having huge problems of its own back home. The question goes forward, is this a coalition of the willing? Is this another ad hoc alliance to further alienate countries like China or Russia, or is it something more serious? One thing that is serious is that this country isn't always delivering from its people, unlike other non-Western forms of democracy, and that's very interesting indeed. Nathan King, CGTN, just outside the White House.
The US-initiated Summit for Democracy has been drawing international criticism. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the summit aims to divide countries into democratic and undemocratic. He says the US is destroying international relations based on international law. Pakistan is among the list of countries opposing the move. Prime Minister Imran Khan turned down the invitation. He says Pakistan would not be in any bloc and the Cold War-like situation needs to be stopped. Cuban Deputy Foreign Minister Josefina Vidal called the summit another great farce by the United States. She says it undermines world solidarity and cooperation, and the US is creating confrontation and division. A new Harvard University poll shows a majority of young Americans believe democracy in the US is failing, and many share the same point of view.
Democracy has been weaponized by the United States, but the weapon is not functioning well because the democracy inside the United States is in a very bad shape. The political system in the United States is very corrupt. The influence of money is very severe. The political scientists in the United States have studied this issue extensively. And the result is that this is the result of studies, that if you don't spend on your campaign as much as your competitor spends more than you do, the chances of you getting elected is only 6%. If you spend more money, the chances of getting you elected is 94%. So basically money determines who wins in US elections.
The problem with this is that Western countries believe that only liberal democracy is a democracy. There is a phrase in the United States in the shops that say one size fits all. But as human beings, we know that one size does not fit all, because each country produces a political system, a social system, a cultural system that reflects its civilization, that reflects its culture, that reflects its history, and therefore liberal Western democracy cannot be the only democracy in the world.
Hungary has blocked the European Union from formally participating in this Summit for Democracy initiated by the United States. Andres Nagy has the details from Budapest.
Hungary has prevented the European Union from being an official participant in the Democracy Summit convened by US President Joe Biden. Hungary is the only EU country that was not invited to the virtual meeting from 9 to 10 December that is addressing the challenges and threats to democracy worldwide. In response, the Hungarian government has blocked a united EU representation. Government spokesperson Gergely Gulyás says the United States has a greater democratic deficit than Hungary.
Hungary does not have the same serious democratic problems as the United States. If we can help and America thinks it needs our advice, we are available. In Hungary, we are not at the point where nearly a third of the voters believe that a democratic election was rigged.
According to analyst Peter Krekó, Hungary's omission was a clear message from Washington.
There are other countries as well within the European Union where there has been democratic backsliding, such as Poland, for example, still because of the fact that they cultivate better relationship with the United States, and we do not see a pro-Russian and pro-Chinese shift as in Hungary. They have been invited to the summit. So the key point here, the key differentiating feature of Hungary is its geopolitical stance.
Because of Hungary's blocking, the EU cannot come forward with a joint written proposal at the summit, and EU leaders can only represent the previously agreed common EU position. On Tuesday, Germany's incoming Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, promised his new coalition government would stand up for a strong EU and nurture the transatlantic partnership.
We want to emphasize the transatlantic partnership and the cooperation in NATO. We want to be a part of the unity of democratic countries. I am very grateful to President Biden that he highlights this aspect of international politics.
The Hungarian government has been battling with the EU for years over issues such as the rule of law and, within that, freedom of the press and the judiciary. US President Joe Biden promised he'd organize the Democracy Summit during his presidential campaign. The meeting brings together political, business and civic leaders to discuss the challenges facing democracy and how to strengthen it.
We can deliver for our people.
The summit will feature a range of key speakers, from the UN Secretary General to the President of the European Commission, with opening and closing remarks by the US President. András Nagy, CGTN, Budapest.
As we just reported, Pakistan has declined to participate in this so-called Summit for Democracy held by the United States. And the invitation came at a time when, after a year in office, Joe Biden has not made any direct contact with Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan. Now, for more on that, let's cross live to our correspondent Danielle Khan in Islamabad. Danielle, tell us more about Pakistan's position on this.
Well, Pandang, the Foreign Office has already made it quite clear in its yesterday's statement that Pakistan is a functional democracy with an independent judiciary, a vibrant civil society and a free media, which goes to show that it is not a big deal for Pakistan to not attend the summit. Though there are no significant reactions so far, but there is quite a lot of appreciation for the government of Pakistan on social media platforms. People are praising the government's move of declining the invitation, saying that the so-called Summit for Democracy hosted by the US is nothing more than a joke. People are pointing to the wars and war crimes the US has committed over the years in the name of bringing democracy in several countries, and has in return killed millions of innocent people. So generally people are standing behind and supporting Prime Minister Imran Khan's decision of not being a part of this hoax.
Thank you very much. Our correspondent Danielle Khan in Islamabad. Singapore is one of the more than 30 countries not invited to this Summit for Democracy initiated by the United States. For more on that, let's cross live to our correspondent Mira Liu in Singapore. Mira, is this kind of a shock to people in Singapore? How are politicians and the public there reacting to this exclusion?
Yes, Pandan. Now, this is not headline news for ordinary Singaporeans, but we had a rare platform where veteran diplomats gathered, and these experts who commented on this matter are not some low-ranking scholars. They are Singapore's top foreign policy veterans. We're talking about Professor Tommy Koh, for example, who is Ambassador at Large at Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations in the 60s and 70s, and then the ambassador for the United States of America between 1984 and 1990. He is a veteran. I want to say that he's well known and well respected at home and abroad. So the comment he made was actually during a book launch where a U.S. Embassy Deputy Chief of Mission was also a guest of honor. Professor Koh asked him, said why Singapore was not invited to the summit, and Mr. Mansour reiterated the points made last week by the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, who said that there was a limited number of invites and that the decision did not reflect on the depth and breadth of the U.S.-Singapore relationship and partnership. Now, Professor Koh continued to say that Singapore should have been invited because it satisfied what he felt to be fundamental criteria for democracy, including giving people the right to vote, holding free and fair elections at regular intervals, and having a constitution protecting fundamental freedom and rights, as well as an independent judiciary and rule of law. Noting that there was no single model for democracy, Professor Koh added that perhaps in the eyes of the U.S. Democratic Party, Singapore-style democracy, with its many unique Singapore characteristics, was not a true democracy. Now, also in the audience of the book launch was Professor Chan Hin Chi, another veteran diplomat who was Singapore's ambassador to the U.S. from 1996 to 2012. She said that the summit was plainly not a good idea, and that some of the invited countries were eyebrow-raising choices. To make things even more interesting, another ambassador at large, Bilahari, who was also formerly Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations, commented audibly from the floor that the U.S. had done Singapore a big favor by not inviting the Republic. So as I said, it's not a big deal here, but we had this rare opportunity to hear some insights from Singapore's top diplomats. Pandang.
Thank you very much, our correspondent Mira Liu in Singapore. Now, for more insights, let's talk to Professor Victor Gao in our Beijing studio and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney in the U.S. city of Tennessee. Let me start with you, Professor Mahoney. And I think it's common sense that in politics you do things on a purpose. So why does Mr. Biden want this so-called Summit for Democracy? Because as the President of the United States, he should have been more aware of the crisis in U.S. democracy than anybody else in the world.
Well, I think his intentions here are fourfold. First, to fulfill a campaign promise Biden made last year when he was branding himself domestically and globally as the Democratic alternative to Trump. Second, to rally what he hopes are like-minded allies to reestablish the U.S. presidency as the so-called leader of the free world. Third, to then lead the willing into a broad coalition against the unwilling. And by this, I mean against those who reject U.S. hegemony and unilateralism, most especially China and Russia. And fourth, to exercise the dialectic I've described in a recent article as the impotent/imperial president, where we generally see an inverse relationship between how weak a president is domestically and his attempts to accumulate power through foreign policy. And in this respect, Biden is the archetypical weak president with very low approval ratings, at serious risk of his party losing control of Congress next year, thus imperiling his agenda and re-election prospects in 2024. Consequently, we see so much posturing and political theater like this summit.
Professor Gao, what do you make of the list of participants? What can that tell us about the U.S. definition of democracy?
Well, first of all, I think this list really reveals the fact that the United States is not dealing with democracy as it is, but dealing with so-called democracy as its preferred list of countries that they feel more comfortable for whatever reason. This is not the right way to deal with democracy. I think the United States, as well as any other country in the world, should realize that no one has a monopoly on democracy, and democracy really represents the true value for mankind as a whole. Every country, people everywhere in the world have the right to democracy. And the United States is really doing a disservice this time because they are inviting about 100 countries and regions to this summit, leaving another 100 or so countries and regions outside of the framework. This is not uniting the world. This is dividing the world. This is not solving the problems. This is creating more problems. And I hope President Biden and his team will realize that they are really not doing a service for democracy. They are doing a disservice for democracy.
And Professor Gao, from military invasion to CIA black operations and color revolutions overseas, do you think the United States has been a trustworthy partner for any country on promoting democracy in the world?
Well, I took a lot of importance to one point made by a former president of a bigger country. That is, it is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but it is more dangerous to be a friend of the United States, because the United States is very much changing its mind, joining one international organization one day, withdrawing the other day, and bashing its ally one day and try to covet favor the other day. This is not the right way for a big country like the United States to behave on the international stage. And this is exactly the same thing that they are dealing with democracy. Now, if we talk about democracy in the United States, then you look at the situation of the seize of the Capitol on January the 6th, and then even up to today, there cannot be a thorough investigation of what really happened. And then you still hear people like the former President Donald Trump threatening democratic traditions and institutions, etc. You are talking about, manipulating the election process, etc. You are talking about things that the United States are faced with, which normally they attribute to only third country banana republics, for example. So I think when we talk about democracy, the United States really need to get its house under order and clean up its own house before they really have the qualification to talk about democracy, especially when they assume that they have a monopoly on democracy and no other country have a better version of democracy. This is not what democracy is really about in today's world.
And Professor Mahoney, at the start of this discussion, you described this Biden administration's Summit for Democracy as political theater. Are you implying that it won't be quite influential as it expected?
It's very difficult to discern any real positive influence associated with the summit. On the one hand, we all know, as has been said several times already, that American democracy is in a period of serious decline at home. And we also know the U.S. is well known for being undemocratic in foreign policy. Even major liberal publications like The Economist and The Hill have criticized this meeting as a charade. On the other hand, the summit has produced a number of negative outcomes, including further alienating China and Russia to such an extent that their ambassadors issued a joint statement condemning the event. It's also alienated a number of key American allies that are explicitly anti-democratic and who were not invited, and confounded more than a few for not inviting some relatively robust democracies like Singapore and Bolivia in place of very questionable ones. That said, perhaps it's just another one of these virtual summits where no one really has to show up. Everyone can basically phone it in, wear shorts under the table. Who knows? Because of COVID, we all know how to fake it during online meetings now. So I'm not sure anyone is really taking it seriously, aside from those who are being snubbed.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney in the US city of Memphis and Professor Victor Gao in our Beijing studio. You're watching Global Watch on CGTN. Still to come.